do. These books will tell you what to do, and they start with the conversation that schools...
Watch all of this at cspan.org. We'll take you now to the floor of the U.S. Senate, where they will continue work on the immigration bill. The measure would boost security and workplace enforcement, allowing tens of thousands of new and high-skilled workers into the country. It would create a 13-year path to citizenship for the 11 million immigrants in the country illegally. A number of amendments, including one from Senator John Cornyn today, requiring tighter border security. Now live coverage of the U.S. Senate.
The chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead the Senate in prayer.
Let us pray. God of our forebears, you have been our refuge in every generation. Don't forsake us during these challenging days. Lord, enlighten our lawmakers so that they will be led by your Spirit as they trust you to guide them with your loving providence. Give them the wisdom to walk on the road beaten hard by the footsteps of saints, apostles, prophets, and martyrs. May they not forget the glorious heritage you have prepared for those who love you. Strengthen them, O God, with your mighty arms, enabling them to serve your purpose for their lives in this generation. We pray in your sovereign name. Amen.
Please join me in reciting the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., June 19, 2013. To the Senate, under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable William M. Cowan, a senator from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Patrick J. Leahy, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Following remarks of me and Senator McConnell, the Senate will be in morning business for an hour. Republicans will control the first half, majority the final half. Following up morning business, the Senate will resume consideration of the immigration bill. Now, Mr. President, we have in order a number of amendments that are now pending. And I would hope that the managers of this bill will work to get times set for these amendments, time agreements, and we'll work out a time to do these as quickly as we can. But if we have to have an agreement to move forward on these amendments, and I would suggest that I don't want, and I don't think we should, have to move to table any of the amendments or anything like that. I think that we should be able to have votes on these. So I look forward to the managers working out a time agreement on these amendments so we can move forward and move on to something else in this bill as quickly as possible. Mr. President, a young woman by the name of Roxana began an immigration success story her whole life. Her parents came from Cuba in the 50s, and they raised their daughter to appreciate the freedoms and opportunities available to her. That was because she was born in the United States. Roxana was born in the United States. She's an American citizen. She wrote to me last month. Here's what she said, and I quote, of course, "I'm proud to say that this country has always been my home," close quote. But when she met her husband, Gennaro, she saw a different side of the American immigration system. He came to the United States 15 years ago, and he didn't have proper documentation, proper paperwork. He left Mexico for the same reasons Roxana's parents left Cuba, to try really hard to build a better life. He worked tremendously long hours when he got here, doing odd jobs for not very much, a few dollars a day to be honest. Then he moved to Nevada, got a job doing construction. He did a little better. And there he did real well because he met Roxana. They married in 2003 and soon petitioned to have his undocumented status changed, adjusted. And although they initially received a letter from immigration officials that gave them hope, they've lived in limbo now for 10 years. Because he's undocumented, he worries every day of being arrested and deported, every day. And he has nightmares every night that he'll be separated from the love of his life, his American wife. This is what she wrote to me in addition to what I've recited earlier. Quote, "We pay our taxes. We've never caused any harm to anyone or been in trouble with the law. We don't stand on corners asking for money. We work very hard to make ends meet. We have friends and family here that we love and who love us. Yet we still feel like we're not wanted here." Close quote. Gennaro is one of 11 million people living in America without proper documentation. Many of those 11 million are parents, siblings, or spouses of U.S. citizens. Some of them overstayed their visas. Some crossed the border illegally. Others were brought here by their parents when they were only children. As I recited 2 days ago, one example in Las Vegas, she was 7 months old when she came here, carried on her father's shoulders. But regardless of how they got here or why they lack the proper documents, these 11 million people play a crucial role in our economy and a vital role in our communities. Now, Mr. President, that was proven last night at 5 o'clock when the Congressional Budget Office, this nonpartisan arm that we look to for a direction with what things cost and don't cost here on Capitol Hill with our legislation, they issued a statement yesterday that this bill certainly, that's on the floor today, this bill certainly is good for the economy. As I will say a couple times during my brief remarks here, it's going over the next 2 decades, what's left in this one and the next decade, reduce the deficit in America by almost $1 trillion. Of course, as we've said here previously, previous to getting the report from CBO, this legislation is good for the economy and good for security. That's a good package. Well, Mr. President, these 11 million people need a pathway to get right with the law. The common sense bipartisan reform proposal before the Senate will help them do just that. It will reduce illegal immigration by strengthening our borders. It'll fix our broken legal immigration system, and it'll crack down on unscrupulous employers who provide an incentive to come here illegally and take, in many instances, tremendous advantage of these people who are desperate. And this measure that's now on the Senate floor provides a route to earned citizenship for 11 million people who are already here, and some have been here for a long, long time. The process for them is not easy. They don't go to the front of the line, they go to the back of the line. But they at least are in the line. They'll have to work, pay taxes, stay out of trouble, and work on English. Now, Mr. President, this legislation will also recognize that the alternative to earned citizenship, that is, deporting 11 million people, is simply not sensible. We don't have the money. We cannot do it fiscally, and we cannot do it fiscally. We cannot do it fiscally, and we can't do it physically. And that's for sure. So detaining and deporting every unauthorized immigrant would cost more each year than the entire budget for the Department of Homeland Security. And not only is mass deportation impractical, not to mention cruel, it's a wrong approach for our economy. Again, Mr. President, $1 trillion reduction in our deficit if we pass this bill, which we will, here in the Senate. Immigration reform that includes a roadmap to citizenship will boost our national economy, I repeat, and increase our security. Helping 8 million immigrants who are already working, of the 11 million that are here, They're working. Some, as we heard from Roxanne, jobs aren't that great, but they're working. You know, just like she says, they're already working. They need to get right with the law, and it'll mean billions of new revenue for our country. It'll mean every U.S. resident pays his or her fair share. That's one reason overwhelming majority of Americans support the legislation on the floor. Not 51 to 49, overwhelming number of Americans. Democrats, Independents, and Republicans. But immigration reform isn't just an economic issue. Mr. President, it's a moral issue. This bipartisan proposal will allow immigrants to stay with those they love, with their U.S. citizen children in many, many instances, siblings and spouses. It will allow Gennaro to stay with his American wife. This is her final plea to me in this letter that she wrote. I pray that you would open your hearts to the millions like me. All we ask is a chance at a pathway to citizenship and the peace of mind to live our lives as meaningful citizens in this great country. Her country, my country, our country. So, Mr. President, I urge all my senators on this side of the aisle, as we say, and the Republican senators, to keep her wish, her prayer, a prayer and a wish she shares with 11 million human beings that are here in America today. This prayer, this wish should be in all of our minds and in our hearts the next few days.
Mr. President.
The Republican leader.
Last year, President Obama was asked about the lessons he had learned from his first term. Instead of focusing on errors in judgment or policy, he seemed to indicate that he really just needed to do a better job, just a better job of telling a story to the American people. In other words, the policy was just fine, and if Americans didn't get it, it was because they had a listening problem. Well, that's an attitude that's really come to define this administration. And I would say that's why folks will be rallying on the Capitol grounds today. They, like a growing number of Americans, are losing faith in government. They think it's working against them, not for them, and for good reason. Let's take Obamacare. This law has been pretty unpopular for several years now. And it's not like the American people haven't been exposed, probably overexposed, to the arguments on both sides of the issue. Obamacare must have been discussed hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of times over the past few years. That includes political debates, more speeches than any of us care to count, issue ads, both pro and con, and guess what? Americans still don't like the idea of Obamacare. Not because they're unable to understand or because they just haven't seen the right messaging. It's because most of them like their health care plan and want to keep it. It's because they don't want to pay more to the health insurance companies. And it's because they don't think the law is going to work as promised. And yet, the Washington Democrats' explanation for Obamacare's enduring unpopularity still seems to be that the law is just too complicated for their constituents to understand. And the Washington Democratic solution seems to be not to actually change the policy, but to spend millions in a campaign-style PR blitz. So the newsflash would be this. If you still don't think Americans are able to understand a law you passed more than 3 years ago, then there's something wrong with the law, not with the American people. Instead of going around the country trying to convince Americans why they're wrong, the administration could actually listen for a change. I think they should start over on health care and embrace the types of common-sense, step-by-step reforms that would actually lower the cost. I'm not holding my breath that that's going to happen. So at a minimum, they need at least to do this. The President, members of his cabinet, and the congressional Democrats who voted for this law need to get out and explain to Americans what's headed their way. Don't feed them a sunny picture painted in the Obamacare ads that the President's campaign team is already running, but actually explain the reality of the situation to them. For instance, Americans need to know about the coming wave of premium hikes. We've already seen projected double-digit increases in some states. They need to know we're likely to see even more Americans lose the health care they want to keep, just like the thousands of Californians who will probably have to look for new plans after Aetna pulled out of the individual market in their state, almost certainly because of Obamacare. And they need to know that they could lose their jobs or see their hours cut or struggle to find work in the first place. In fact, a recent survey showed that about 70% of small businesses say the law will make it harder for them to hire. Americans need to know all these things because they need to prepare for them. And it's supremely unhelpful when the President claims that those who already have health care won't see changes, as he did just a few weeks ago. He knows that that's not what many experts are saying. He owes it to the country to be frank about that. And so it's time to get off the campaign trail, call off the PR spinmeisters, put down the communications plan. It's time to level with the American people. Now, Mr. President, on another matter, it's been over 140 days now since we settled here in the Senate the issue of the Senate's rules. We settled it conclusively, not only this January, but actually January 2 years before that. What happened this January is we had an extensive bipartisan discussion about what rules or standing orders we might change. In the wake of that discussion, we passed 2 rules changes and 2 standing orders. And the majority leader said, well, this is what he said 2 years ago: I agree that the proper way to change the Senate rules is through the procedures established in those rules. The procedures established in those rules, and I will oppose any effort in this Congress or the next to change the Senate's rules other than through the regular order. Now, that was in January of 2011. This year, what he said back in 2011, and the reason I put that up, even though that was a previous Congress, he said either this Congress or the next Congress, the Congress we're in now. And so this January, I said to the majority leader I would confirm that the Senate would not consider other resolutions relating to any standing order or rules this Congress unless they went through the regular order process. That was this January, just a few months ago, a little over 140 days. And the majority leader said that is correct. Any other resolutions related to Senate procedure would be subject to a regular order process, including some consideration by the Rules Committee. Now, that's not ambiguous, Mr. President. That's not ambiguous at all. And so the reason I and my colleagues have been talking about this repeatedly is this is a huge institutional issue. And the naive notion that somehow you can break the rules of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate for nominations only was laid out by Senator Alexander yesterday, in which he suggested a hypothetical series of measures that, if I were in the job the majority leader is currently in a year and a half from now, would be a very appealing agenda to my side. Things like repealing Obamacare, things like national right to work, things like opening ANWR. Now, I would say to my friends on the other side, that that's not something that they would be very excited about. But you know, in American politics, things change. And there's a tendency when you're in the majority to be kind of arrogant about it and to think that the rules of the Senate are unnecessarily inconvenient to what you're trying to achieve. Well, the Senate was designed from the very beginning. George Washington was actually asked during the Constitutional Convention, what do you think the Senate's going to be like? He said, I think it's going to be like the saucer under the teacup. The tea's going to slosh out of the cup down the saucer and cool off. In other words, they anticipated that the Senate would not be a place where things happened rapidly. And written right into the Constitution is advise and consent. Advise and consent. The Senate has a role to play, for example, on nominations, which seems to be the fixation of the majority at the moment, nominations, even though there's no evidence whatsoever that this administration's been treated poorly with regard to either executive branch nominations or judicial. No evidence at all. This is a manufactured crisis. Nevertheless, they seem to be focused on nominations. What do my friends in the majority think advise and consent means? Apparently they think it means sit down and shut up. Do what I say when I tell you to. I don't think that's what the founding fathers had in mind. So there are a number of reasons why we shouldn't go down this road. Number one, the majority leader gave his word, and your word is the currency of the realm in the Senate. That ought to end it right there. Number two, don't assume that you could just sort of surgically break the rules of the Senate to change the rules of the Senate for nominations only. And number three, I think it'd be appropriate, since the American people change their mind from time to time about who they would like to be in the majority in Congress, to think about the consequences when the shoe is on the other foot. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of mourning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half.
Mr. President.
The Republican whip.
Mr. President, we obviously are talking about immigration this week and last week and next week. I am one of those who, after many years working on this subject, I hope we are successful in passing what I believe is good, credible immigration reform. I've come to the conclusion, like many Americans, that the status quo is simply unacceptable. I've talked a little bit about some of the bodies in unmarked graves that I witnessed myself in Brooks County, Texas, where under the current broken system, people come across the border from faraway lands only to die trying to get into this country and be buried in unmarked graves in places like Brooks County. I've met with a young woman who was prostituted after having been brought into the United States from Central America, where she worked in a Houston nightclub where she was basically held as an indentured servant or slave because she knew that she was vulnerable to deportation, and so the person who brought her there and put her in that situation knew they had the power to keep her quiet and not disclose what was happening while she was living a horrific existence. Those are just a couple of examples why I believe our system is broken and neither serves our economic interests nor represents our American values. So I want a good solution to this, but it's not just what happens here in the Senate. That's not the end game. The end game is what happens when this bill goes to the House, and once the House and the Senate get together in a conference committee and reconcile the differences between those two bills to see if we can actually get a bill that reflects our values and that represents our economic interests. Things like recruiting the best and the brightest minds from around the world to stay here in America and to create jobs here. Those are some of the things that I think are positive things in the underlying bill that we need to preserve. But there are other issues we need to fix, and that's what I want to talk about right now. Last night, the Congressional Budget Office released its long-awaited report on the underlying bill, the so-called Gang of Eight immigration bill that people have heard so much about. The report, as usual, is a blizzard of numbers and estimates and projections. But here are two I want to talk about in particular. You see reflected on this chart. I think this is going to be a shocking revelation to most people who thought that this bill would actually fix our broken immigration system. And if you'll see behind me, it says the number of new unauthorized immigrants in the U.S. by 2033, with the passage of the underlying bill, 7.5 million. Without it, 10 million. So what we see reflected in the Congressional Budget Office, which is the coin of the realm, the gold standard, whatever you want to call it around here, love it or hate it, and we all find ourselves on different sides depending on the issue, but the gold standard, the Congressional Budget Office, says this bill will not fix the underlying problem. In other words, despite all the promises, and perhaps I might say the hopes and the dreams and the good intentions of the authors of this underlying bill, this bill will have only a minimal impact on illegal immigration. Does that sound like the kind of solution that we owe to the American people to solve this broken system? Does this sound like a solution to solve our long-term problem in this area? Well, I want to take just a moment to discuss another portion of the bill that's gone largely unnoticed by most of the country. But first, let me respond to some remarks made by my friend from Arizona, Senator McCain, yesterday. I'm going to agree, not disagree with Senator McCain. Standing right here on the Senate floor, as he so often does, Senator McCain said he was absolutely confident that U.S. authorities can obtain 100% situational awareness and full operational control of the southern border. And he cited the head of the Border Patrol as his authority. I was glad to hear him say that, because I agree with him exactly. He's exactly right. But I was a little confused at the same time. He repeated a comment that the majority leader had made about my amendment, which is now will be pending soon before the Senate and we'll vote on later today or tomorrow. He called my amendment a poison pill, suggesting that it would somehow kill the underlying bill. Well, if the standards in my bill or my amendment are exactly the same as those in the underlying bill of 100% situational awareness and 90% operational control, defined as 90% of capture of people crossing the border illegally, Senator McCain thinks it's attainable. The Border Patrol chief thinks it's attainable. I think it's attainable. So how could that possibly be a poison pill? I just don't understand it. As I've said numerous times over the last week, my amendment uses the same standards and many of the same metrics as the Gang of Eight bill. Here's the difference. Here's the difference. My amendment establishes a real border security trigger before immigrants can transition from probationary status, something called registered provisional immigrant status, before they can transition from that probationary status to legalization. Under the Gang of Eight bill, that would occur after 10 years of probationary status. But the problem is, contrary to initial advertisements back in January, where Senator Durbin, among others, the distinguished majority whip, said back in January that the pathway to citizenship is contingent upon border security, only to say just a few days ago, quoted in National Journal, where he said, now we've delinked the pathway to citizenship from border security, and indeed they have in the underlying bill, and that is what my amendment is designed to fix. Here's the real tragedy. 1986, Ronald Reagan signed an amnesty for 3 million people. That's not the tragedy. The tragedy is, in return, the American people were said, we're going to fix our broken immigration system. We're going to enforce the law. Well, we all know what happened. The amnesty was granted, and the enforcement never came. Here's the tragedy. The underlying bill, without an amendment like mine that provides a real border security trigger that realigns the incentives for the right, for the left, for Republicans, independents, Democrats, everybody, to be focused like a laser on how do we actually implement that operational control of the border, which Senator McCain believes is attainable, I believe is attainable, the Border Patrol chief believes is attainable, without realigning everybody's incentives to focus like a laser on attaining that objective. This is 1986 all over again. All we have to do is look at the polling to tell us, and I don't think we even need any polls to tell us, that there's enormous skepticism across the country about Washington. This bill says, trust us. Trust us. Well, there is a trust deficit in Washington, D.C., and on immigration, when so many promises have been made in the past that have not been kept, I think it's unreasonable to ask the American people, just trust us. So we need an enforcement mechanism like my amendment, which will guarantee that everybody is aligned and is highly incentivized to make sure that those border security measures are upheld. So we don't have what's reflected on the chart behind me as reported by the Congressional Budget Office yesterday. 1986 was the year that Congress passed an amnesty for illegal immigrants without guaranteeing results on border security. Ever since then, members of this chamber have said, we will never make that mistake again. And yet, the underlying bill would effectively be 1986 on steroids. And the CBO report confirms it. That's why those of us who actually would like to see a good, credible immigration bill passed, not only here in the Senate but also in the House, believe, as I do, that this legislation is dead on arrival in the House of Representatives without a real border security trigger. It's going to be a challenge even if we put that in, but we have a much better chance of success if we deal with the problem that the Congressional Budget Office has identified, and if we deal with the experience we've had from 1986 and other times when we made extravagant promises to the American people how we're going to fix the system only to find that those promises have not been kept. That will be the real poison pill to this bill. And it will also be an unnecessary and lamentable tragedy if somehow we can't, working together, find a solution to our broken immigration system. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this week President Obama and his allies are launching a big summer push to convince people that his health care law will not be a train wreck. Now, we've heard in the Senate from one of the authors of the health care law that he saw a train wreck coming, so now what we see the Obama administration trying to actually sell the bill. Not that it's good or bad, just trying to sell it in any way they can to make the American people think about it in ways that may change their mind, because the American people know this is a health care law that's not really doing what they wanted, which is what they were looking for, was trying to get the care they need from a doctor that they want at lower cost. But that's far from anything that the American people are going to see. So what we see today in Politico is the headline, "Selling of Obamacare officially begins." Selling of the law that was passed. not something that's good, just trying to sell the law itself. Washington Post this morning pushes on to promote health law. Push isn't on to promote better care, not more affordable care, no, just to promote the law. Well, I believe, Mr. President, it's going to be a tough sell. A new poll out earlier this month showed that only 37% of Americans think that the health care law is a good idea. Well, that's even fewer people than think it was a good idea when the law was passed 3 years ago. Now, remember, the Democrats promised the American people that, well, the law would be actually overwhelmingly popular by now. Well, that's nothing further from the truth, because this law is more unpopular now than it was when it was passed. So now we see the President of the United States pulling out all the stops, trying to sell this horribly written law that's bad for patients, it's bad for providers and nurses and doctors who take care of those patients, and it's going to be terrible for the American taxpayers. So what the President is doing is joined by a new group, a new interest group, and the group is called Enroll America. Well, this is a group, and who's running it? Well, former Obama administration officials moved from the White House to this group trying to sell this health care law. This is the group that part of what we've known as the Sebalia Shakedown, the efforts by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, who was asking health care businesses to donate to this organization. This group has started rolling out a PR campaign trying to convince people to sign up for insurance under the President's health care law. Now, I agree more people need insurance, but we have to make sure that the people not just have insurance, but get good care. That's what this is supposed to be all about. And the President keeps talking about more coverage. What we need is care for people, not just more coverage. So you take a look at that and say, is it actually going to work? And according to this article in this morning's Washington Post, it talks about the president of this group, Enroll America, former White House staffer, who said yesterday in a telephone interview that she said the group's research shows that 78% of uninsured people don't know about the changes coming in January. So you have to say, what kind of insurance are people going to be able to sign up for? What are they going to get to choose from? What choices will they have? What will they find in the exchange? And by the way, the exchanges are running way behind time. That was a front page story in one of the national papers today. So first of all, for a lot of people, in terms of trying to sign up on the exchanges, what they're going to find it's going to be a lot more expensive than it would have been for them if this health care law had never passed in the first place. Now, remember, the President said that policies would actually be $2,500 cheaper by the end of his first term, and now we're seeing policies actually a lot more expensive, not just from what the President promised, even more expensive than what they would have been had the law never passed in the first place. So now here's an editorial from the Racine, Wisconsin Journal-Times. This is how they put it the other day. They wrote, quote, "Despite assurances from Democrats that the national health care plan will drive down health care costs," the President's promise, said the evidence is increasingly telling the opposite tale. This is Wisconsin. I mean, this is a state which just recently elected a Democrat to the United States Senate, a state that went for the President. Here's another headline that Enroll America won't be talking about when they try to cite the President's health care law. This is from the McClatchy News on Tuesday. The article is titled, "Obamacare's Big Question. What's it going to cost me?" I mean, that's what people want. That's what they want to know. That's why folks were interested in a health care law in the first place, because they were paying too much for health care, and they needed and looked for care that was actually more affordable for them, right for them. The writer from McClatchy, under this headline, "Obamacare's Big Question, What's it going to cost me?" writes, "Early rate proposals around the country are a mix of steep hikes and modest increases. Either way, insurance rates are going up everywhere. It's just a question of how fast and how high, so there's no surprise that the people across the country are disappointed and feel they've been misled by a president when he said rates will actually go down by $2,500 a family." So when we look at the states that have been putting out their numbers for next year, for a lot of people is the answer to the question, what's going to happen to rates? Well, they're going up very fast and very high. In Ohio, the average individual market health insurance premium next year will be 88% higher than this year. That's according to the state insurance department. That's the state's official numbers. In California, for a typical 40-year-old man who doesn't smoke, rates in insurance exchange will increase by 116% next year. The McClatchy article also quotes one health care expert saying that under the President's health care law, there are winners and there are losers. And I agree, Mr. President, that's absolutely right. There are winners and there are losers, and we'll talk about some of them this morning. But the problem is the President and Democrats in Congress who pushed this Health Care Act into law, well, they never said, never admitted to the American people that there were going to be losers. Enroll America is telling everybody to sign up for health insurance, but they aren't admitting that the law picked who wins and who loses. So let's take a look at that. It's another important point of this health care law, what's going to happen and what this new insurance is going to look like. Well, it's going to be loaded onto the backs of young people. Under the law, many young people, many young healthy people will have to pay a lot more for each older, sicker person who will pay less. For the President's scheme to work, these young, healthy people will have to buy high-priced, government-mandated insurance they may not need, they may not want, that may not be right for them. Here's another point about what Enroll America is telling people and what it's not telling people about the new Washington-mandated insurance. This group put up a blog post recently talking about ways states can maximize their Medicaid enrollment. That's one of the strategies that Enroll America is pushing, get more people signed up for Medicaid. But a government Medicaid card doesn't ensure patients actually get access to quality medical care for themselves or their families. According to one survey, a third of physicians nationwide are unwilling to accept new Medicaid patients. Other studies have concluded that some patients in the Medicaid program do even worse in terms of health than people who have no insurance at all. The Congressional Budget Office predicts that the health care law will put another 13 million people into the broken and failing Medicaid program. Even with the enormous expansion of Medicaid, even after a Washington mandate that everybody in America must purchase health insurance, and even after Enroll America's big push to sign up more people, the Congressional Budget Office, the people who research this, who study this, say the number of uninsured Americans will never fall below 31 million. Will not fall below 31 million people even over the next decade. So in spite of all of this revamping of a health care system, significant changes, much to the detriment of the American people, because the President was focused on coverage, he's still leaving 31 million people uncovered and others paying much, much more. Winners and losers. Lots of losers, Mr. President. This law will cost $1.8 trillion over the next decade, according to the CBO. It still fails to help millions and millions and millions of Americans. So then the question is, who is actually being helped by the law? Because I said there are going to be winners and going to be losers. Well, the Wall Street Journal just the other day, page B1, Monday, June 17th, wanted health care legal experts. Legal experts. The lawyers are turning out to be winners under the health care law. Not the patients, not the providers, not the taxpayers, the lawyers. The article says, quote, some companies are warning that President Barack Obama's health care overhaul will cost jobs. Well, it won't be in their legal departments, the article says. It goes on. Health care companies racing to comply with the Affordable Care Act and other rules are calling in the lawyers, sparking a mini boom for specialist attorneys who can backstop overloaded internal teams and steer clients through an increasingly crowded regulatory minefield. Well, the point of the health care reform should be to help the American people, not just to create more jobs for lawyers. The point should be to increase access to care for people, not just to send them Medicaid cards and tell them that they're covered. The point of reform should be to help people get the care they need from a doctor they choose at lower cost. President Obama doesn't want to talk about the ways his health care law picks winners and losers. He doesn't want to talk about the many, many losers under his plan. Enroll America doesn't want to level with the American people to tell people that the health insurance that they get under the president's law might be one that is not the best for them. If we're going to truly reform our health care system in this country, the president and his allies should start by telling the American people how his law falls short. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Live coverage today of the U.S. Senate as they continue working on bipartisan immigration legislation. The measure would boost border security and workplace enforcement. It would allow tens of thousands of new high and low-skilled workers into the country and create a 13-year path to citizenship for the 11 million immigrants that are currently living in the country illegally. Senate leaders have agreed to 10 amendments to be considered. The time of the vote has yet to be determined. Other amendments may be offered later. Among the amendments to be considered today is one offered by Senator John Cornyn that requires tighter border security before provisional residency provisions kick in. While we wait for further debate, the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense this morning is holding a hearing on the 2014 budget request for the Joint Strike Fighter program. Top military officials are testifying along with the executive officer of the program. Senators today looking into the program's costs, schedule, and performance. Democratic Illinois Senator Dick Durbin is the chair of the committee. This got underway this morning at about 9:30.
Many other suppliers to buy that. So we will compete that type of thing. Another example is the global supply chain. We will have airplanes all over the world in the next 10 or 15 years. There is no reason to believe that a prime contractor whose niche is building and manufacturing airplanes could be or should be a world-class global supply chain expert. There are other companies out there that can do that, and we will explore those kinds of options. So competition is one piece. There's a second piece that we're working on very aggressively. That is what we call our reliability and maintainability program. Until a few years ago, this was an airplane on paper. We did not have airplanes flying. Today, we have over 7,000 hours under our belt and over 5,000 sorties. The information that I'm gaining from flying those airplanes today is invaluable. I can show you a list of the 50 top parts on the airplane that are breaking more readily than we thought they would. I can show you the 50 parts on the airplane that are taking longer to repair than they should. By systematically looking at a reliability and maintainability program where we attack those problems by either redesigning the parts or finding a second supplier or finding a way to better repair those parts organically, say by standing up your depots, you can begin to attack the reliability and maintainability of the program. We couldn't do that a number of years ago because we didn't have any real data. We have a lot of that data now, so we're doing that. The third piece is that $1.1 trillion estimate that you talked about has an awful lot of assumptions in it that those three gentlemen at the other end of the table have a lot to do with in terms of how many hours does each pilot need to fly relative to getting training in a simulator? How many maintainers do I really need on the flight line to launch this airplane? Those kinds of assumptions, which we put in place many, many years ago that came up with this $1.1 trillion number, are now being relooked at because we know more about the airplane. And they, with their advice and with their assumptions, we will go back in and now relook at the CONOPS, or the concept of operations, for maintaining and sustaining the airplane and adjust those numbers. I personally think you'll see over the next few years those numbers coming down, sir.
Thank you very much. Senator Cochran, any follow-up?
Mr. Chairman, I have one follow-up question. General Paxton, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Amos, has indicated the Marines expect to save up to $1 billion per year in operation and maintenance costs by having one type of tactical aircraft in inventory, and that billions of dollars have already been saved over the last decade by not recapitalizing the Marine Corps with fourth-generation aircraft and waiting to recapitalize with the F-35. Given increased F-35 costs and production delays, is this still true, or is it time to start looking at alternatives as well as continued commitment to the F-35 program?
Thank you, Senator Cochran. I believe the basic premise, the Commandant's previous statement, and then when you connect it to the comments that General Bogdan and Mr. Kendall just made, the basic premise of cost and affordability is true. It's coming down, And as we actually have more flight hours and more sorties and more reliability of the data, we have a better ability to predict the actual flyaway costs as well as the cost per flight hour for the aircraft. I come at this a little differently as opposed to the gentleman at the other end of the table who are either technicians or aviators. I'm a grunt. I'm an infantry guy. So when I look at the program and the viability and the value of the program, sir, I go back to the basic premise that we have 3 type model series that we're going to do away with, the FA-18, the EA-6B, and the AB-8B. So there's an inherent cost savings in necking down the type model series. In addition, as we get more reliability, as General Bogdan said, and we get actual facts from those hours and sorties, we have the capability of collapsing a little bit the maintenance that's done at the depot level, at the intermediate level, and at the organizational level. We actually have Marines out there right now turning wrenches on things that we didn't expect to happen this early in the program because we've been able to identify where some of those mean times between failure is and what they can actually do. So I believe as the program gets more mature, the comment that General Welsh made earlier about the value of stability in the program, it's not an issue of too big to fail, sir. It's an issue of stability and using stability to create an advantage and turn risk into opportunity because I'm confident we can bring the costs down on this. And then the bathtub that we're in, where we have aging 4th-generation legacy aircraft, we'll be out of there, and then we will be into a 5th-generation aircraft that we can optimize as we use around the world in many more places to do many more things. So thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Senator Shelby?
I want to go back, if I could, Secretary Kendall, to the technical challenges because General Bogdan alluded to some of them just a minute ago. What are, say, the top 3 technical challenges? I'll just throw, is it software? Is it develops and will help you expand your envelope and so forth? Is it metal fatigue or problems with metal production, you know, the failure of that? What is it? And I'm sure all of them hadn't been satisfied, but I feel technically they will.
I will give you my 3, and General Bogdan may have a slightly
Is that important to work this out?
It is. We have a list of things, obviously, that we're attacking. The top 3 on my list would, first of all, be software and getting the software completed. The Block 3F capability is critical to the airplane, so we need to get that done. We'll have to make some decisions as we get further along. We're about to do a critical design review for that software, and we'll be looking at it very closely this fall. The second thing on my list is the helmet. The cockpit of the airplane is designed around the concept of that helmet and the ability of the pilot to look through the structure of the airplane and to have all the things he needs in front of him in the visor of that helmet to operate effectively. There are a number of issues there that we've been working. As I mentioned earlier, we're kind of at the edge of acceptable, but we're not where we'd like to be to get full utility out of that. So that would be second. The third thing is the thing that came up a moment ago. It's reliability. We're not where we need to be on reliability right now, and I think we can do better on that. We're lagging our own goals by a significant margin right now in terms of the reliability that we're actually seeing on the airplane. We need to improve that. So those would be my top 3, and I'll let Chris add anything that he would.
General?
Sir, I would tell you software, software, software. But realistically, Mr. Kendall got it right. Software is number 1 on the list, and he talked about that.
But the software, if I could, and correct me if I'm wrong, expanding software, you know, software that people are thinking up and putting together, that would help you expand the envelope of the capability of this plane, would it not?
Absolutely, sir.
It's key. Go ahead.
The software on the program, first of all, just to give you some perspective, the airplane itself has 10 million lines of software code in it. That's about 5 times more than any other airplane we've ever developed. And that's just on the airplane. The off-board systems, the maintenance system, the mission planning system has another 10 million lines of code on it. So this is virtually a flying computer. If you don't get the software right on this program, all of those things that General Welsh and the CNO and the Vice Commandant of the Marine Corps talked about are not going to work right. We have many sensors on the airplane, and they all have to talk to each other to provide the pilot with the situational awareness he needs to go into those very high-threat environments. If you don't get the software talking right to those sensors, you will have a problem. The good news there is, over the last 2 years, we have made significant progress in the way we develop, test, and field software on this program. I'm cautiously optimistic that in the future, what we've learned over the last 2 years can be applied to the future, but that does not mean that we are out of the woods yet, because the hardest part of the software development on this program still lies ahead of us in our Block 3, and that's where we attempt to take all the information from one's own airplane, from another F-35 flying next to you, and all the other sensors that we have in our arsenal, and put that all together to give that pilot a picture.
You believe you can do it?
I do, sir. And the reason why I believe that, and I'm cautiously optimistic, is because a lot of the foundation of what we need to do in 2016 and 2017, we're flight testing today. Okay? And it's working. It's not working perfectly, but there are no things that I look at in the future relative to software that I do not think we can overcome, to be quite honest with you. A couple of years ago, I'm not sure we could have said that on the program, partly because we hadn't flight tested much of it. But we have 40% of the flight testing done now, and we're starting to learn a lot more. One of the other things that Mr. Kendall didn't mention that is always on my mind is the maintenance system on this airplane is a huge information technology system. We call it ALICE. And what it does is it combines both the maintenance of the airplane, the supply chain for parts on the airplane, and the training for the maintainers and the pilots, and puts it all together. That system has great promise. But that system, like any other complicated information system with software, has got serious problems. Okay? What we did over the last year, instead of keeping that logistics maintenance system in that part of the development program organizationally, we pulled it back underneath our engineering team. So they are dedicating the same kind of software work that we use on the airplane to the maintenance system. I believe over the next 2 years, and you can hold me accountable for this, we will see great improvement in the ALICE system.
General Welch, you have anything to add to that?
Senator, I'm pretty confident because while it's not the same thing and it's not nearly as complex as doing it on the actual airplane, we've integrated this concept in the simulator, which has been working well for training for some time. Now, there aren't as many lines of software code in the simulator, but the data integration concept works tremendously well. One pilot described it to me as if you're flying around in a 200-mile bubble of information. That's the concept behind the airplane. That's why the helmet's so important, because that's how it's relayed to the pilot. But the integration, everything as a young fighter pilot, I grew up flying around thinking, boy, I sure wish I knew X. X is now available to somebody flying the F-35. It's displayed for you on a very easy-to-understand concept. The biggest problem for the pilots is figuring out how do you manage the info. And that's what they're focusing their training on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Shelby. It was a good question, and I think it puts in perspective what we're talking about here. Who could have imagined 12 years ago when somebody said, let's do a joint strike fighter, what the evolving threat would be that we face today and will face in the future, and what the evolving technology would be. Couldn't have dreamed we'd be carrying these around in our pocket. Maybe they could have, but I wouldn't have. And we're dealing with that. And it takes a sense of optimism, Mr. Secretary. I don't think that's a negative in every aspect. I think it's positive when it comes to our view as Americans, facing challenges, meeting them head on, and conquering them. And despite some setbacks here, we're on the path now to the development of a plane that's going to make America safer. Thank you for your testimony today. We're going to have the second panel come on now, and I'll come by and say goodbye to you. And thank you for your testimony. Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, Michael Gilmore. From the GAO, Michael Sullivan. And from Brookings, Michael O'Hanlon will be the next panel. We're going to welcome the second panel here once we've got name tags switched. There we go. Our first witness on the second panel is Director of Operational Test and Evaluation, Honorable Michael Gilmore. Dr. Gilmore, please proceed. Your written statement made part of the record, and please proceed with your oral testimony.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cochran, Senator Shelby. I agree with the statements that were made by a number of the previous panel members that the program now is on a much sounder basis than it was back in 2009, preceding the Nunn-McCurdy review and the restructuring and the technical baseline review that actually extended, all those activities extended into 2011. They put the program on a much firmer basis by taking a hard-nosed look, a rigorous look at past program performance, and I'm not talking about ancient programs, I'm talking about programs like F-22, what it took to make those planes operational, what were realistic assumptions about what kind of testing actually needed to be done, what kind of, they're called test points, needed to be flown, what could modeling and simulation really tell you versus what you needed to have the aircraft itself tell you. How many aircraft did you actually need to do testing? So we added a significant number of aircraft to conduct the test program. We added a substantial number of test points, not relying on modeling and simulation or unrealistic assumptions about so-called test efficiencies, which the Program Office, unfortunately, is beginning to talk about again. And I also agree with the statements that were made by Lieutenant General Bogdan and Mr. Kendall that there are many important challenges that remain. In particular, the Block 3F software, which is going to provide the most important combat capabilities, has yet to be flight tested. It's just an early version of it is just beginning development. What's the history of flight testing that software up to this point? Well, as I looked at the most recent data from the Program Office in preparation for this hearing, as of the end of May of this year, not all of the Block 1 test points had been completed. They were supposed to have been completed some time ago. The Block 2A software test program, flight test program, was supposed to complete in February of 2013. According to the Integrated Master Schedule version 7 that the Program Office is funded to. My estimate, that did not occur. That flight testing did not finish at the end of February. And my estimate is that it could extend anywhere from January of 2014 to August of 2014. Block 2B in Integrated Master Schedule 7 is supposed to finish flight testing in May 2014. My current estimate, based on the pressures that I see building in the program, is that it will finish around December 2014. Now, admittedly, these are not the multiple-year disconnects with reality that existed prior to 2009. These are 6 to 12 months in schedule slippage relative to the Integrated Master Schedule to which the program is funded. So that is obviously an improvement, but it does demonstrate that, as many of the previous panel members said, this is an extremely complex undertaking, and it's very difficult to project with any certainty, although we're doing a much better job of it than we had been, how long it will take to finish all of these complex developments and demonstrate through testing that they actually work. Some of the previous panel members talked about 90% of the development being complete. Well, that depends upon how you define development. To me, the development isn't complete until the capabilities, the military capabilities, are actually demonstrated through testing to work. Many of the panel members talk about development of the software being complete when it's actually available for the first time to be loaded into the aircraft. And what we're finding is that we discover a number of problems, many problems that require what's called regression testing and other testing to sort through and fix once we actually start the flight test program. I would note that the PEO, Lieutenant General Bogdan, noted that the Block 2B software program is just a few weeks out of step with his current schedule, and that is true, but his current schedule is based upon a rebaselining that the program did back in November of 2012 that added 31 weeks to the development program for the Block 2B software and subtracted 31 weeks from the flight test program. Now, that's a concern to me because what that means is the flight test program is undergoing an accordion-like squeeze, and I'm afraid that it may mean that some unrealistic assumptions are being made about flight test efficiencies. And so I hope that that decision to increase the 31 weeks needed for development of the software, which was prudent based on what we've been seeing, but to then subtract 31 weeks from the flight test program so that the end point, the fleet release of the 2B software, stays there in 2015 consistent with needs for operational testing and IOC in the Marine Corps. I hope that's not a harbinger of decisions that were made early in the last decade, which yielded the need for the restructuring. Finally, you mentioned a concern about how do we reduce risk, what lessons should we learn. Mr. Kendall mentioned that we needed much more rigorous developmental testing and that we should wait longer before we begin production. I mean, production in this program started before there was any flight testing at all, which was unprecedented in the history of aircraft development programs. And so that's about as concurrent as you can get. That's pretty much 100% concurrency. Obviously, that's a bad thing. We need to have more rigorous developmental testing. We need to let that developmental testing proceed before we make production decisions. But let me also say that my experience with early operational assessments, where we take versions of aircraft, tanks, other military equipment before a production decision is made, before a decision to go to low-rate initial production, put it in the hands of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Let them tell us what the problems are that they see at that point, even though when we start production, low-rate initial production, we still have a ways to go in terms of developing all the final capabilities. Let the actual people who are going to have to use this equipment and rely on it tell us what the problems are that need to be urgently fixed before we ramp up the full-rate production. Under law, we do the operational test, the initial operational test, just prior to full-rate production. But I see great value to doing these operational assessments prior to a decision to begin that low-rate initial production. So I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gilmore. Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cochran, Senator Shelby. It's a pleasure to be here this morning to discuss the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter Acquisition Program. As the Chairman pointed out, the program is now 12 years old, having begun in 2001. Since then, its development cost has grown by more than $20 billion, and the estimated average cost to buy one F-35 has doubled, from about $69 million to $137 million. Clearly, the program's original business case was deeply flawed. In 2012, after the program breached its cost estimate, the Department did reset its business case. Talked about that on the first panel. They added significant dollars to the cost estimate, more time to deliver aircraft. And since then, the manufacturing process appears to have stabilized and has shown progress in delivering F-35 aircraft. Today, however, we're here to discuss risks to this reset business case moving forward, and from our perspective, there are three. These are software development, concurrency between flight testing and production, and the funding assumptions from the program that underpin the current business case. In the area of software development, the F-35 will depend on about 24 million lines of software code, both on and off the aircraft, to be able to fly and to meet its missions. Today, software deliveries continue to lag behind, and the contractor continues to struggle to meet schedules. As long as software delivery is questionable, the initial capability of the aircraft is at risk. With regard to concurrency, the program is now negotiating its 6th and 7th production lots of aircraft. When that negotiation is complete, it will have invested about $34 billion to procure 150 aircraft, with less than half of the flight testing completed. As we've heard repeatedly on the first panel and from Dr. Gilmore, this creates risks that problems found during testing will force design changes that will have to be retrofit onto aircraft in production or already delivered at additional cost to the government. Finally, the program's current cost estimate assumes annual funding of more than $12 billion on average for development and procurement over the next 24 years, and continues to estimate operation and support costs at over $1 trillion across the F-35's 30-year life cycle. The Department has already deemed this unaffordable. It's setting targets to try to reduce this, and the Congress may want to consider whether these funding assumptions are reasonable in our current fiscal environment.
Suspend the quorum call.